If you're not familiar with Douglas Park, it is on the west side of Chicago. This is a photo of one of the signs for the park with some Chicago landmarks in the background. It's taken on the south end of the park. You'll notice the name has 2 S's. That took a lot of work to make that happen. And it's a very interesting story how the park went from being Stephen Douglas Park to being Anna and Frederick Douglas Park. It's one of many, many stories we could be telling that we're not going to tell today because we'll run out of time. So that's why we put together a resources and references page on the blog that I've been running for Douglas Park for several years now called douglasparknature.org. The reference is right there on the page. It's also in the chat at the very top. Unfortunately, that Douglas only has 1 S because it was put together several years before the name change. So anyway, who am I? I guess we forgot to introduce ourselves at the beginning. I am, I guess to the Chicago birding community, I'm best known as the father of 2 formerly young birders, Ethan and Aaron, who really made names for themselves over time. Now they're grown up, and so I'm going to let Ethan introduce himself later. Aaron was not able to make it today, though. As far as myself, I used to go birding in college. My spark bird back then was a Cooper's hawk that showed up in our backyard. Then I kind of laid off birding for a long time and, got into other things like getting a PhD in paleontology, working at a bunch of different museums and things like that. And then I wound up being a stay-at-home dad to Ethan and Aaron. And they're the ones who got our family into birding way back when they were in elementary school, like 1st and 3rd grade. So let me go to the next slide, Ethan. Here we have a map that shows a number of the West Side parks, one of which has been talked about before at a patch chat. Humboldt Park up in the north here. Columbus Park is over here. Garfield Park is in the middle. Douglas Park is down in the lower right corner. This is a map of the west side of Chicago. And one of the things you won't see on the west side of Chicago is large areas of blue. We're not right on the lake. We don't have any major rivers nearby. So these big west side parks are pretty landlocked except for the lagoons that were built about 100 years ago. Another thing to know about these parks is the part of the Chicago they're in was at the end of the glacial times under the ancestor to Lake Michigan. Then Lake Michigan shrunk and left these areas as marshes and wet prairies. They're very flat. When it rains a lot, the places that have not been modified in various ways still want to become marsh again. And we'll get back to that in a minute. The other thing that I want to say is, well, some people keep asking me, why is somebody who lives in Oak Park monitoring birds all the way over in Douglas Park? Because, we gotta go on the traffic jams on the Eisenhower Expressway to get here. Why would we want to do that? Well, that goes back to a story about Columbus Park back when my kids were a little older than 1st and 3rd grade. We used to go to Columbus Park all the time to go birding. And one time we saw a real cool interaction between a Cooper's hawk and a peregrine falcon. I think the Cooper's hawk was chasing the falcon. We posted about it on the Illinois Birders listserv at that time called iBet. And Ethan asked me to append at the bottom of the post that we were going to, from here on out, become the informal bird monitors for Columbus Park. While Alan Anderson, who was associated with Bird Conservation Network at that time, shot back, well, why don't you become the official monitors for Columbus Park? And by the way, we also have Douglas Park that doesn't have a monitor. Why don't you take that over too? And so that's how we got interested in Douglas Park. For the first, 5 or 6 years, we only went there maybe once a month or so. But in about 2012, Aaron, my younger son, decided that he wanted to be the official monitor all by himself for Douglas Park and wanted to go there after school at least once a week, if not more. And so that's how we started doing really weekly monitoring in the park. And when Aaron got interested in other things and went off to college, he kind of handed it off to me, but I've still been going there every, usually 4, 5, or 6 days. Every 4, 5, or 6 days I go there and count all the birds I can. I think we're ready for the next slide. Here's a little bit of a closer view of Douglas Park. There are some hospitals around and things like that. There's a lot of other things around. There's a high school within the park. There's big areas of blue in the park. If you don't drive, there's bus lines on Roosevelt Road and Old Route 66, also known as Ogden Avenue. There's a pink line stop a little bit south of the park. If you ride your bike, there are bike lanes through the park, and coming from the west, there's one along Douglas Boulevard. And if you drive, you can park along most of the streets, not Sacramento. You have to watch out for no parking signs that go up during special events. But other than that, it's pretty accessible, I'd have to say. It is considered, or it has been considered, to be an underbirded park along with the rest of the West Side parks. Although during pandemic times, more people who are not traveling as far as they maybe wanted to go birding, they're stopping by places like Douglas and Humboldt and Columbus Park. So they're not quite as underbirded as they used to be. Let's do the next one. Next slide, Ethan, there we go. So we've divided Douglas Park into 3 major sections to talk about during our presentation. Up here in the far right corner are the lagoons. It's a couple of lagoons that are surrounded by mostly mowed lawns, but also right at the edge, there's a lot of meadow strips and emergent vegetation. There's an island, there's a lot of trees. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that some of those trees are dead, which is cool because that means birds roost in those trees. And if you get up into the far northwest corner, there's a stone bridge where you can look out into an area that's very dense with trees and shrubs. I call it the inlet. There's some years there's a waterfall running at the far end of the inlet, and that's also a very cool place to look for birds. Next slide. The next area we're going to talk about, I call the sanctuary. I call it the sanctuary because that's where you find a lot of the really cool birds, and that's where a lot of birds breed. It also has a lagoon. That lagoon is surrounded by more emergent vegetation. And if you go to the next slide, there's also a golf course there. Actually, there's also 2 golf courses there. There's one larger practice golf course, and then the mini golf course we'll talk about later. Because of the golf course, they put fences around there. And because of the golf courses, some people will call it the golf course area. I still call it the sanctuary because there are a lot more birds there than there are golfers. Because of the fence, you should know how to access the sanctuary. At the far west end of the big building called the Field House or the Cultural Center, there are steps that take you right into the sanctuary. There's also gates that are open sometimes, and there's places on the south side and the west side where either people stole a section of fence to, I don't know, they used it for scrap metal or something, and another place where a car recently crashed through the fence, and those are access points also. Next one. So the next section we term romantically south of Ogden. That's where the great big playing fields are. That's where the concerts go on those great big playing fields. But there's also at the north edge, there's a pond called the Lily Pond with weeping willows around it, emergent vegetation, floating vegetation, dragonflies, frogs. And in the distance, there's a building built by Jens Jensen a long time ago called the Flower Hall. There used to be formal gardens in the area between the pond and the Flower Hall. Those were ripped out more than 10 years ago. Next. And you can see in the upper left, that's a view of the playing fields where they were at that point setting up for one of the concerts that took place there this summer. The other slides show trees, mowed grass and trees. Now, mowed grass and trees is not my favorite way to have a park, but at least the trees around here are the kind that bring in interesting birds at various times of the year. There's hawthorns and crabapples, honey locusts, and hackberries. And as Ethan will be talking about later, those are great places to see birds at various times. Next slide. Okay, so where are the birds in Douglas Park? That's one of the questions we want to answer. Just in general, I'd have to say the birds are everywhere. They use the whole park, even the place where they put the concerts. Just as an example, on Thursday morning of last week, I went out on July 14th and spent several hours there. I saw a total of 38 species. 28 of those species were around the lagoon area. 26 were in the sanctuary. And even though they were setting up for the concert, there were still 12 species south of Ogden. We'll get into a lot more detail about where to find the birds as we go through things. The way we're going to go through things, next slide, we're going to go through things by the season. Where are the birds or when are the birds in Douglas Park? Well, there are birds all the time now. If you can't read it, the lower part of this graph goes from January on the left all the way through December on the right. And the vertical graph counts how many birds we found during that month. In the wintertime, January and February, there are birds in the park, but not that many. But starting about March, migration season begins for the spring and numbers climb, sometimes exceeding 120 birds found during the month of March. Numbers drop again during the nesting season, June and July, and then they start creeping up and until about October or November, and then they start creeping down into the winter again. So as far as the number of birds we found, let me move something here. So far in 2022, we found 136 species. During all of last year, which is shown on the graph, we found 153 species in the park. In all time, back beginning in 1997 with the first eBird checklist ever submitted by Luis Munoz for Douglas Park, we've had 208 species found in the park. The most recent one was found by Rob Andre. It was a lark sparrow found for the first time in Douglas Park in April. So Ethan is going to take over. He's going to talk about spring. I'm going to be back to talk about breeding season. Ethan's going to talk about fall and winter fall migration and winter, and then I'm going to be back and talk about some other things. So Ethan, it's your turn to talk.
All right. Yeah, so to give a quick introduction, my dad mentioned a lot of it, but I've been a Chicago area birder for the early parts of my life. Then I moved off to undergrad before coming back for a bit over a year to do a gap year where I birded Douglas a good deal more. Before I went off to where I currently am, which is grad school, researching how birds evolve and form new species at the University of New Mexico. So yeah, I'm gonna start with spring, and I'm gonna start with the beginning of spring. You saw there, that's kind of, saw in the past graph, spring is kind of the big hot season of the park, and it starts relatively slow as early as February, where you get stuff like red-winged blackbirds setting up their territories and killdeer moving into the lawn areas when snow melts. You can also get occasional treats like one, I think is of February, there's a flock of snow geese that moved over. Other geese will turn up at the park this time of year. And then gradually other things trickle in. For example, particularly on the Sanctuary Lagoon, you can get some diving ducks such as this bufflehead on the right. The lawns, as I mentioned, have geese coming in, and on some of the bare areas, especially near meadows, you'll get sparrows, starting with song and swamp and fox sparrows early in the transition to other species as the season progresses. Once you get bugs coming out, though, that's when things really start to pick up rapidly. You start by getting both kinglets, the chattery ruby crowns and the high-pitched golden crowns. You get swallows trickling in, starting with tree, then barn, then the rest, roughly in no particular order. And then you get your first warblings, namely early yellow runt, in addition to one that can be pretty exciting because it's relatively difficult to find in a lot of other regions of Chicago, Louisiana water thrush, not pictured here. And then, yeah, as spring progresses, more and more species turn up. You get dabbling ducks joining the divers and the resident mallards, plus with breeding wood ducks. You get some sandpipers, particularly solitary. Occasionally other stuff shows up. I'll get into that a bit more in fall. You get all sorts of random things from marsh birds like soreds to woodcocks, which are generally flushed up in a surprised manner from the forested areas. And you can sometimes find some real surprises like the bittern, which in turn led to the bird Douglas Park is probably most known for, which is an Elania that I turned up along the edge of the lagoon in some willows, initially in the Sanctuary Lagoon, where the bittern was hiding out. Allegedly in the field, I mentioned that I thought it would be an Elania, but that would be impossible. And eventually it was posted online, discussed at length until eventually the idea was narrowed down to small build. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I think the majority of people were convinced it was small build by a couple of weeks after it showed up. And it was because of all the diverse habitats and food sources at Douglas Park that the Eladia was able to stick around for a few days, long enough for birders to see it and also find a lot of other cool stuff at the park that we don't normally get. That's stuff like pectoral sandpiper, I think. That was our first record. Most notably the conch sparrow, which I'm not sure has shown up since, actually. And then as April progresses and we move into May, you get more and more stuff turning up. You get more warblers, you get buntings, you get rare sparrows like the grasshopper in the top right there. The herons turn up. You still get lingering dabbling ducks in the lagoons, again, particularly the sanctuary lagoon. Warblers and whatnot can turn up anywhere, but the trees along I would say my favorite spots are like the inlet that my dad mentioned earlier, and places like parts of the sanctuary tend to have the most activity. But you really have to look all over the place. As I mentioned, for warblers, you find them up at the trees. Oh, I forgot to mention, for warblers, one of the best areas, especially later in migration, is south of Ogden, where there's a bunch of honey locusts that this past spring were just ridiculously full of bay-breasted in Canada and blackpoll. Although the southern parts of the lagoons also had a lot of action. So you really have to be vigilant wherever you are. You'll get some unusual pass-through stuff like broadwing hawk showing up. I believe whippoorwill has been turned up in spring in the park before. On the ground, you can find skulky warblers like ovenbirds, in addition to sparrows. On the edges of the lagoons, you get water thrushes. You can find other marsh birds like marsh wrens showing up in the cattails on the edge of the lagoon as well. In general, those cattails in the sanctuary lagoon in particular have a tendency to turn up really cool stuff, but it's pretty tough to find stuff like the bittern, the marsh wren here. You get wintering half-hardies that we'll talk about later turning up in there. Anyways, yeah, stuff can show up anywhere. Gotta look for flyovers too. One time a cattle egret turned up in the park. And I think we first saw it as a flyover, I don't remember. But yeah, gotta pay attention, look everywhere. And migration eventually towards the end of May kind of tails off. But that's kind of the best time of year to find some of the most sought after migrants that the park is really good for, like yellow-billed and black-billed cuckoo, turn up around then. Generally, you flush them out of a tree and find where they land. Olive-sided flycatchers, one that the park's got a good track record for on those dead branches or dead trees that my dad mentioned earlier. And Connecticut warbler, more so in the past, it's really relatively common in the park compared to most places in Chicago. It used to be very reliable in the sanctuary area. However, as it got overgrown with buckthorn, it became less reliable there. This past spring, I had a really nice one in a kind of, I think, a good Connecticut warbler spot, but a non-traditional one, kind of in some just overgrown lawn vegetation next to a short tree. Not the first time I've had one and stuff like that, but yeah, all of this stuff, plus like morning warbler, you could get in a late May visit to the park, in addition to catching some of the breeding behaviors that I will give over to my dad.
Okay, so nesting season actually is a pretty long season in the park. It begins for me when I find the first nesting Canada geese, which is usually in early April, and it continues all the way till when I see the last, at least until I see the last fledgling American goldfinches sometime at the end of July, maybe, or at least during August. So it overlaps with spring migration, and as we'll learn a little later, it also overlaps with fall migration. Next slide. So when I first started going to the park in the summertime, I was really kind of surprised to find out how many different birds nested in the park. Everybody talked about Douglas Park and the other West Side parks as being great places to go for migration. But then most people who are bird watchers, well, a lot of them stopped going to places like that in the summertime, but I kept on going and I kept on finding cool birds that were nesting in the park. Examples, cedar waxwing gathering some nesting material, a Baltimore oriole in the center building a nest, and a common yellowthroat who has babies on the nest and is catching bugs to take back to the nest. Now, the thing about breeding birds in the park is there's a lot of them breeding there, but you don't always find the nest. You've got to establish by other means that they are nesting in the park. And then, Ethan, can you hit the next slide? Then you got to figure out how you're going to tell the rest of the world about what you found. Now, one of the things we do when we go to the park, everything we find in the park goes into an eBird checklist. eBird is an online database that can be used by scientists or by just regular old birders or by anybody else to see what has been found in a particular park. A part of eBird checklist that most people don't use very much gives you a chance to tell eBird what you are finding in the way of evidence that the bird is nesting in the park. On the far left side, that's what I see on my laptop when I enter something there. In the middle, that's what I would see on my iPhone when I try and enter breeding codes there. And the thing about the breeding codes in eBird is they're not given as an easy form of output to interpret. So if you want to go back and review what you've been finding in terms of breeding codes, you got to like download all your data and sort it out and pick through it bit by bit to get your evidence and put it in some kind of organization that makes sense to you. Now, the organization I've been using recently is shown on the right. It's a table that lists kinds of evidence that tell you that you've got confirmed breeding on the top of it with a nest with young as evidence for sure, and then something like carrying nesting material or nest building. Not as strong evidence, but that they really went ahead and finished the nest, but at least it's going to let you say it's confirmed. There's other evidence that is probable evidence that things are birding, like a bird singing in the same place for a long time, or a bird getting really agitated when you get close to it. And then there's a couple of things at the very bottom of my little chart that are probable evidence of probable nesting, and that's just birds singing or birds hanging out in the place where they might nest. That's just possible, I should say, just possible nesting. Can we hit the next slide and we'll give you an example? Now, one kind of nest I find almost every year in Douglas Park are the nests built by orioles. So way back at the beginning of May, I started hearing orioles singing, and I entered that on my little chart down at the bottom. Finally, on June 9th, I actually found a nest that had been built right next to the parking lot in a honey locust tree. That's the center picture here. That's the dad looking down into the nest, probably with a female sitting on eggs at that point. And then by June 21st, not only the eggs hatched, the babies were making noise, and the parents, both parents were flying in with bugs to feed them. So I got to check off both a nest with young and feeding young as my scorecard for Baltimore Orioles this year. Next slide. Another nest that we always look for starting in about March is the Cooper's hawks. And we've had a Cooper's hawk pair that nested there for year after year, mostly on the far west side of the park and the other side of Sacramento. It's cool to see baby Cooper's hawks on their nests, which are built almost entirely of sticks, so usually 40 or so feet off the ground. It's also cool to see the somewhat larger nestlings, but be careful you don't get too close or Mama Cooper's hawk will come and take a dive at you. At least the one that usually nests in Douglas Park will do that. They're a little bit more skittish than the ones that nest in my neighborhood. Next. So every time I went to Douglas Park, starting at about the beginning of March, I would look for nests. And I finally found a candidate for this year's nest in a place that bothered me because it was south of Ogden, south of the lily pond, and right at the north edge of the field where they were going to start holding big concerts in June. This had me worried for two reasons. First of all, the people setting up for the concert might be dive bombed by the mom while she's doing her nesting. And secondly, it might scare everybody off. It might, we might lose the nest because of what was going on in the area. So what happened before the concert was set up? Well, we did start seeing an occupied nest with a Cooper's hawk tail sticking off to the light and left side of the nest in the lower right photo. And then right before things shut down for the concert, I could see the young ones, a little white fluffy bit sticking out at that upper right photo. There's a red arrow pointing at them. And then what happened? Next slide. They put up the fences for the concert that was going to take place in June. And I could peek through one hole in the fence along Ogden and see the bottom of the nest, but I couldn't see anything else. So for more than 2 weeks, we didn't know what was going on, and we were concerned. Fortunately, when we could finally get in there, when the fences were down, we did find not only the birds were still there, they had already fledged their young. The photos on the left show one little bird peeking over the side of the nest on June 27th, and another bird, another fledgling Cooper's hawk down below on a branch below the nest. And then a week after that, the fledglings were even bigger and stronger, and they were in the weeping willows that are around the lily pond, and the parents were flying in and feeding them. So I found nests for 5 different kinds of birds in the park this year: Canada goose, barn swallow, Baltimore oriole, Cooper's hawk, and eastern kingbird. But there were a lot of other birds that nested in the park, and I didn't find their nest, but I did have other kinds of evidence to suggest that they were nesting. I think the coolest one for me is the pied-billed grebe, and they nest in a place where I'm not going to go wading, in the emergent vegetation around the edge of the sanctuary lagoon. I heard them singing a lot earlier in the spring, and then they disappeared for a while, and I was hoping, like has happened twice before, that sometime in June, the little babies would emerge with their parents, and that's exactly what happened on June 3rd. 2 little babies came out in that top photo, and the mom fed them. So I got to not only put recently fledged young on my little chart, but feeding the young. Not as good as finding the nest, but I kept my feet dry. And I just wanted to let you know the little grebes have gotten bigger, and they're still on the lagoon in the sanctuary swimming around, and you can see them. You can tell they're not growing up because they still have that dark and white pattern on the head. Now, that's the cool stuff when you can find evidence that confirms a bird is nesting. The less cool stuff is on the next slide. What if you only hear the bird singing in the same place time after time after time? Well, that's what happened with some of the birds that nested in the sanctuary around the edges of the lagoon in the meadow habitat in there. And I was not going to go stomping through that meadow habitat and killing the plants just to find the birds. I was going to just, be content with what happened. So that willow flycatcher sang time after time after time. It disappeared, no willow flycatcher for a week or 2. And just yesterday, I found them in a honey locust looking for bugs, and maybe there was a young one there, maybe not, I couldn't be sure. So that's probable evidence of birds singing, birds nesting in the park. Next, we go to the least satisfying. You only hear a bird singing, but every time you hear it, it's somewhere else. Right now, that's where American goldfinches are. I think eventually we won't find the nest, but we will find the young ones come out July or August. We might still see fledgling black-capped chickadees. I'm not sure that red-eyed vireo and eastern wood peewee really nested in the park, but they were singing week after week, always in a different place. So one other thing that you can't account for in eBird using their breeding codes is what happens when you have birds on the next slide that are nesting somewhere else, but they keep coming to the park day after day to catch things to feed their babies. For instance, in the lower left, black-crowned night herons nest at Lincoln Park Zoo, but some of them catch fish at Columbus Park and take them back to feed their babies. And a lower center, great blue herons come to the park every day and catch food, and they fly off to nest somewhere in the Southwest. Herring gulls probably are nesting on a factory roof some year, but we see it somewhere in Chicago. Caspian terns are probably nesting somewhere on the lakeshore, maybe tens of miles away from Douglas Park, but they catch at least 1 or 2 adults, sometimes 3 will show up to catch fish and take them back. So, we can't score them as nesting in Douglas Park, but we can at least give the park an assist for the score that happened somewhere else. Next slide. Next slide. Oh yeah, I should mention that we've already got some baby birds coming in. Some black-crowned night herons that were probably raised at Lincoln Park Zoo have shown up at the park. And yesterday there were 3 juvenile herring gulls that have shown up and were fishing on their own on the lagoon. Their dads and moms weren't feeding them anymore, but they were checking out the park and finding food there on their own. So to summarize what I found this year, I can take all my chart data and put it into one chart with histograms. I've got 16 species of confirmed nesting birds this year, 8 species of probable nesters, 7 of possible nesters, and what is that? 6 birds that 6 kinds of birds that were assisted. The chimney swifts I added to that because they come to the park for water and bugs, even though they nest in chimneys in the surrounding neighborhoods. Then I can take a chart like this and take off the names and flip it on its side and start doing comparisons year to year. And you can see the number of breeding birds is fairly steady in the park, but we have lost some the last couple of years, including Eastern Phoebe that was scared away by the construction of the mini golf course because they always used to nest right where they were doing the construction back in 2021. And a few other birds that we didn't get nesting in 2020 didn't show up this year either. We can also, I collect breeding bird data at all the major parks I go to week after week. So I can compare with Columbus Park and with Reese Park too. Columbus Park is also a large park with lots of lagoons. It has more woods than meadow. So it has a slightly different mix of breeding birds, but pretty much the same number. Reese Park has a lagoon, very little meadow habitat, a lot of trees with mowed grass. So they have fewer breeding birds, but they still do get Baltimore Orioles and Eastern Kingbirds and things like that nesting regardless. So while I'm looking at breeding birds, in July, there's a lot of other things that are starting to show up, things that I know did not nest in the park, but they still showed up, and that turns it over to Ethan, who is going to take care of the rest of the year.
Yeah, so as my dad mentioned, you've got these post-breeding wanderers that are breeding in the area, but they don't show up at the park at all. They don't utilize it like some of those other species, even though they certainly could, in theory, use some of the habitats, right? There's some other species that a nuthatch, you could see a nuthatch being there. However, due to the exhaustive years of coverage that my dad has of the park, this regular monitoring effort, in addition to contributions of others, you can get a graph like this and look at the patterns that you might not otherwise expect. Here with spotted sandpiper, you're going to see a few of these graphs. For all of them on the y-axis, you have frequency, that is the percent of eBird checklists submitted at Douglas Park that have the species included in them. And on the x-axis, you have date from January to December of the year. So pretty much showing you how the frequency of report for these species varies throughout the year. I want to draw your attention for spotted sandpiper to this major dip that occurs from late May to mid-June, which is pretty much when they are done with migration, they're nesting, and then we start getting the young ones showing up at the park in June and July, resulting in pretty high frequency of report for a lot of the late summer. Similarly, white-breasted nuthatches drop off in mid to late spring and then come back in early June. I'm not quite sure what's going on with the November thing there. It seems like they kind of dip out again in late fall briefly. This in particular is a cool example of how these birds, if you as resident, really aren't as stationary as we might think. I mean, there could very well be some short distant migrant white-breasted nuthatches from, say, Wisconsin or even Minnesota in here. It's just a big area of research that we are missing out on, but we can start parsing little things like that apart with data like this. Now, another thing in the transition to summer, fall is shorebirding. So starting from around now until about the end of September, shorebirds are passing through the Chicago area. It's a pretty tough county to reliably find shorebirds in, although it's gotten better since I was young. Douglas Park, in theory, could be pretty productive. There's a field that is prone to flooding. However, recently, this mud-prone field has not fed shorebirds, but rather gotten concert goers muddy, such as heat wave blocked the shorebirds out right now, or just a bit ago, and Riot Festival again in September. Now, fall migration as a whole is pretty similar to spring. Warblers can turn up more or less anywhere. Each one's have their preferred habitats. Walking the lagoons can never, in the sanctuary, can never go wrong. Same with south of Ogden, like the Lily Pond. And the general performance of these warblers is similar between fall and spring, except you have some species like mourning warblers that are much easier to find in spring than fall. Some of those might be due to, I think the mourning warbler one is genuine. Some of those might just be due to detection frequency. Another major fall, emphasis on fall migrants are blackpoll warblers, probably helped by the fact that big flocks of young ones and other drab non-breeding plumage ones will be foraging on the ground like these, something you don't see too much in spring. You also get broader envelopes of migration in fall here and other places. This is most visible in the blackpoll warbler, where they're around for give or take an extra month compared to how long they're around in spring. This is why, although spring migration has flashier birds and they're singing, so it's a bit easier to track them down, fall migration can be really rewarding for a long period of time and kind of lets you more slowly see the transition through the season and different birds showing up. Now, a really cool thing about fall is that it's a good time of year to kind of have nailed down places for seeing particular birds tied to seeding flowers and fruiting trees. These trees, a lot of them are found south of Ogden, like hawthorns and hackberries, serviceberries and crab apples too, particularly hawthorns, I believe. Have a lot of thrushes and even stuff like woodpeckers or tanagers that visit them and eat the berries. They can be a really reliable way to see a good amount of birds pretty up close. You can see this nice assortment of pictures of these birds utilizing these resources. Now, both for these trees and for the next ones, the fruit not only attracts the birds themselves, but also insects for the birds to eat. And the other thing that does that are seeding flowers, which attract warblers in addition to seed-eating birds like the black-throated green on the left, and then iconically orange-crowned warbler on the right, which folks who have birded Chicago in mid to late October might know that they really like these seedy goldenrod patches that time of year. Same with stuff like late Nashville warblers and Tennessee warblers will turn up in the same stuff. But I would say in terms of raw biomass, you get a lot more sparrows, particularly white-crowned, white-throated sparrows feeding these wildflowers that include stuff like black-eyed Susans and goldenrods and coneflowers. It's kind of, I believe, for those ones, mostly native prairie flowers. But you turn up unusual stuff too, like Vesper sparrow and Harris's sparrow have turned up in the past. And you don't just look in the flowering plants for these, they can also be in adjacent lawns, foraging around too. And these seeds remain relevant as we transition to winter, both for sparrows that we'll get at it in a bit, but also for these finches. Goldfinches are particularly cool for showing how utilization of seed resources change throughout the year. In the summer, you get these ones, including the bright adult males, feeding on thistles to feed during the peak of their breeding season in late summer. In the fall, they start transitioning to those wildflowers, and as those are eaten up, they'll even move on to burdock, this kind of unpleasant burr that'll get stuck to any like cottony piece of clothing that you have on it, be a pain to get out. Good reason to wear like a rain jacket or similar when birding the park that time of year. You'll even get these wildflower feeding goldfinches joined by redpolls later in the season. And those will also forage in stuff like ash trees and birch trees, feeding on catkins. You get purple finches doing the same thing. It's helpful to know the calls for these, but they look pretty distinct from goldfinches. So if you know what you're looking for on a good redpoll year, you could pretty reliably pull them from these flocks. Maybe not reliably, but have a chance at pulling them from these flocks. And this brings me into another fun part of the transition to fall and winter, which is half-hardies. So when I say half-hardy, I don't actually remember how often this term is used in Illinois. It was used a lot in Western New York where I went to undergrad. This refers to species that start wintering in an area but don't make it to spring. I don't think it's very well established whether they are more likely to die of cold or starvation, or if they just move on their own. I would certainly like to believe the latter. It's certainly the latter for some species, maybe not all. Don't want to be too optimistic. But anyways, you get differences in how often species will attempt and how long they last in the park throughout the season. So this is an iconic one, swamp sparrow. As I mentioned before, they like the cattaily areas to some degree, but they also really like the weedy stuff if there's still seeds in there. And on the right side of the graph in December, you can see that reported quite frequently from the park. But when you loop around to January, you start seeing a really big dip into February where they almost are absent from the park, but then suddenly recover when the migrants come in and bolster their numbers in early through mid to late spring even. We've even got a couple of records of them. I believe these were singing birds in the cattails of the park. So they are almost year round at the park, although it's probably a lot of turnover between which ones are in the park at any given time of year. Another classic example in the Chicago area are winter wrens. In the fall, you see them doing stuff like on the left, where they'll forage in the undergrowth. But at Douglas Park, at least in the winter, they tend to favor these really dense cattail-y areas, in my experience. They can be really tough to find if you don't either know the call or have a recording of the call to bring them out. I think we've gotten better at finding them over time to some degree. But anyways, you can see on the right side of the graph there, somewhat present in December and occur at modest frequencies throughout the rest of the winter. So they're pretty good at lasting in those habitats when they're around. I imagine that varies to some degree based on how harsh the winter is. We also have fox sparrows, which kind of similar to the other ones, start early and then taper off. And you can even get oddballs like this yellow-throat that tried to spend the winter a couple years ago, even made it into January before departing. We've also had a water thrush turn up in the winter before too. You never know what can show up that shouldn't be there. Now the last thing in the vein of fall to winter transition are geese. So cackling goose top left, and snow goose top right are the more frequent ones. The Ross's goose in bottom left and greater white-fronted goose bottom right are less common. And actually, they look like they're more common than they are. The Ross's goose peak is one bird, and the big greater white-fronted goose peak is one bird that a lot of people chased. That's a challenge of using bulk eBird data for something like this, as opposed to if I just downloaded everything and filtered it to just the monitoring that my dad's done over time. But anyways, you get these turning up in the Canada goose flocks, but the Canada geese can also have some interesting stuff of their own that I'll turn over to my dad.
Yeah, well, in the wintertime, Canada goose flock numbers will start building until they hit 600, 700, 800, even 1,000 geese in the park. That photo below shows the field south of Ogden trying to become a marsh again after some heavy rain and melting snow. That's a good place to look for geese, and you can look for the rare geese, but there's some other things that turn up also that are kind of interesting. The photos above on the right, there are some geese that have neck collars around them with numbers on them, really easy to see. People who've been birding in Chicago for 7 and 8 years probably have seen these things because those were done by State of Illinois program to learn more about the wintering Canada geese in the Chicago area by marking them and then having people keep track of them through those net collars. And they even put transmitters on some of them to keep track of them and then follow them as they flew all around North America, it turns out. Now that's a really cool story that we're not going to tell, but again, we have the resources page linked at the very top of the chat, and there's some popular articles, there's some scientific papers about what they learned about those net-colored geese on that resource page. What I'm going to talk about is something I finally noticed back in 2014 after looking at probably a couple 100,000 geese in my lifetime, and that is that some of those geese have these plastic markers on their legs. And if you're not looking really closely, you'll miss them like I did for many years. What you can do, next slide, is you can take the number on that and you can submit it on a website by the United States Geologic Survey and give the information about when and where you found it. And they'll give you back a certificate that tells you about where the goose was banded, where it got that marker, what sex it was, if they knew it, how old it was when they banded it. And that's cool information to have. It links you to that particular goose in a particular way. Now, most of the time when you do something like this, you get your certificate and that's it. You don't hear anything more. But the thing about these geese is the Columbus Park leg mark geese keep coming back to the park. And if Ethan will hit the next slide, I have one goose that I first saw in 2014, number C120, that I saw a couple times during that winter. And then as you move up and move closer to today, I saw it again and again and again, 54 times over 8 years. The goose I showed before, C321, it showed up again and again and again until I'd seen it 26 times. I have found mostly in Columbus and Douglas Park, 90 different marked geese. And I've seen them in combined more than 1,000 different individual times that I could submit the data to USGS. And well, a couple of things about this. First of all, this links me to some individual geese. And when fall comes around, September, October, I start looking for these geese. Did C120 make it through the winter again? Did it get shot? Did it die? Or am I going to see it again? C120 keeps coming back. C231 again also keeps coming back. So when I go to the park in the wintertime and there's a lot of geese and not much else, I do find my friends, my individual relationships I have with these geese. Next slide. And then there's also, when you add up all those observations, there's some generalities you can start to saying things we've discovered by recording all this information. First of all, every goose marker I've seen was banded in Thunder Bay, Ontario by the same guy. He does about 100 geese like that a year going back probably about 20 years now. On average, about 2% of the geese I would see on a day when I find lots of geese in the park, about 2% of them have those markers from Thunder Bay. And many of those geese coming back, keep coming back to the park year after year after year. Some of them go to Douglas Park, some of them go to Columbus Park. I've never had one of those Thunder Bay geese show up at both parks. They come in the fall, they leave when the snow gets deep in the winter, and then they come back again when the snow melts, and then they go back north. Now, where they come from, where they go to, we don't know. But the other interesting thing is they usually hang out with the same set of marked geese. There'll be 1,000 geese in the park, and I'll find maybe 2 or 3 clumps that have Thunder Bay geese in them. And some of them, I always see them with another goose, or maybe 11 out of 12 times I've seen that goose, it'll be with another goose that was banded the same day. So there's all this stuff going on. I'm not sure how much of it is because these geese are related, how much is because they're from the same geographic area. But there's interesting things going on with these geese that otherwise people kind of regard as poop machines. If people, more people notice these things and submitted their finds to the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, we might be able to learn more about these geese. This is an old technology, but I think it's still a very useful technology. And can we go to the next slide? Now, all those wildflowers and things that Ethan was talking about earlier, this is what they look like in peak season for the summer wildflowers. This was taken yesterday, and you can see the cultural center in the background. This is taken in the sanctuary right next to the edge of the lagoon. All around that lagoon, there are wildflowers. There didn't used to be quite so many wildflowers, but you'll see how they got more most recently. These were mostly planted when they put in the golf course, the practice golf course, about 20, 25 years ago. I have not been able to find much information about how that was all done. I'm going to have to try and do some living history interviews before more people retire to find out exactly what went on then. But I do know about how they've been managing these areas since then. One of the things they've been doing, next slide, is burning. Every 3 or 4 years, they come by and burn the meadows. That might be surprising to some people. It might be surprising to see what a roasted golf ball looks like on the lower left. But every time they put up one of those upper left burn notice signs that tell us they're going to be burning the areas in the park over the next couple of months, they put them up in the fall. I'm happy because I know what's going to happen after the burn is done. All those wildflowers are going to come back, and the native wildflowers are going to be thicker than ever. So go to the next slide. The other thing they do occasionally, like 3 or 4 times since we've been there, is they have people come in and take out the brush that's easy, not so easy to handle by burning, like the meadow areas are. They take out the buckthorn around the edges of the park that are more wooded, and they take out the willows that will take over everything around the lagoons if you don't try and handle them. That also proves to be useful because where they take out the willows, that's where we, and where they take out the buckthorn, that's where we get a lot of the breeding birds that I otherwise only hear singing. They probably wouldn't be there at all if we didn't take out that brush and do the burns. Next slide. Now, this is kind of interesting. Back in the fall of 2019, right before the pandemic hit, one day I came there and found a whole bunch of people from the natural areas who had cleared away everything on the north side of the sanctuary lagoon, between that lagoon and the miniature golf course. And they had drilled a bunch of holes in the ground, and they were laying out a bunch of plugs, which were living wildflowers that you would put in those holes, and then they would start growing. And guess who did the planting? Well, Roger Goodell, well, not yet. Roger Goodell showed up from the National Football League, along with some retired Chicago Bears players and a bunch of high school students, the mayor, and there was a big event to plant wildflowers at Douglas Park as part of the NFL, National Football League 100th anniversary celebration. That was kind of cool, and I put some links to articles about it in the resource page. But the cool thing to me is to come back 2 years later and see what we got. And we have new wildflowers growing in that part of the park that I had never seen in the park before. I first saw the Culber's root on the left and the rattlesnake master in the center. I first saw them last summer, and they came back this summer. And then I first saw the mountain mint this summer, the one with the monarch butterfly on the right. Now, it's going to take a lot more work with more burns and maybe some more planning to get these up to really high grade restoration areas around the lagoon. But it's so cool to have these things, not just because I like wildflowers, but because there's other things that like wildflowers. And that includes the next slide, bugs. With all the parks I go to, Douglas Park is the best one for bugs. Some of them are ones I hope the birds don't eat, like the dogbane beetle on the left. That's one of my favorite beetles. There's a lot of dogbane on the east side of the lagoons, and dogbane beetles show up there every year. Of course, everybody loves the monarch butterflies, eating some asters or drinking from asters on the right. I don't know, do you like grasshoppers, anybody? Well, I like grasshoppers, and grasshoppers like Douglas Park, in my experience, more than any of the other parks I go to on the west side of Chicago. And the other thing that likes them is kestrels, American kestrels. There's one eating a grasshopper. Kestrels are one of these birds whose numbers have been declining in the Chicago area and elsewhere. And I think one of the reasons that's happening is because there's a lot fewer grasshoppers today than there were in the past. There's a lot fewer of all kinds of insects than there were in the past. And that, according to recent studies, is having an impact on bird populations. That's one reason bird populations are declining. And we put articles about that on the resource page as well. What's our next slide? Is that you, Ethan? Or I know what it is. Yeah, okay. Well, so we're doing all this birding in the park. How are we going to share it with other people? While doing those eBird checklists is a good way to share things with the eBird community. And eBird community can include a lot of birders who are on eBird. It should include other people too who are just interested in birds, even if you don't submit your own eBird checklist. If you go to the eBird hotspot page for a place like Douglas Park, you'll find it's filled with all kinds of information about what has been seen in the park in the past, what has been seen yesterday. And if you don't know what it means when it says snow goose, you can click on that marker and it'll take you to a whole bunch of information about snow geese as well. So I regard eBird checklist as a way of outreach to the community, mostly the birding community, but hopefully people are just getting into birding as well. About 5 or 6 years ago, the then alderman for the park had made it his dream to install a permanent music venue in the park. And the place he wanted to put it was the large meadow area in the sanctuary. And this got a lot of people concerned. It got me particularly concerned because I knew that was a place where birds like indigo buntings and common yellow throats and yellow warblers and other things like that were breeding in the park. So how could I let other people know about this information that was on eBird and in my head, but nowhere else at that point? And that's the next page. that's when I put together a Facebook group, outreach to the community through a Facebook group called Nature in Douglas Park, Chicago. Those of you who are familiar with Jeff Scratney's group, My Years Birding in LaBois Woods, well, that was the inspiration for what I did for Douglas Park. Back then it was called My Year Birding in LaBois Woods. But anyway, I started posting pictures of birds that I would find on that page, and I'm still doing that today. The page has developed since then. It's got like 317 members now. And next page. Other people on the left there are submitting pictures of birds and videos of birds that they find. People like me post articles about things that are about Douglas Park, like there's an article about the mini golf course we'll talk about in a minute. And we also post about issues, other kinds of issues related to Douglas Park that are directly related to the park or to the nature in the park, or in this case, the thing we talk about the most right now is the effects of the mega fests on the south side of the park. Back when they were changing the name, that took 2 years, and so there were a lot of things posted about the name change from Stephen Douglas to Anna and Frederick Douglas Park about 3 years ago, starting about 3 years ago. Next page. I was concerned, I thought maybe parents and teachers who might like that Facebook page would want to share it with their kids, but maybe would not want to share the other stuff on their Facebook page with their kids. So I put together a blog/website where I put extra information about all the different animals I'd seen in the park over the years, and where I periodically post other things as a blog. Like for instance, the one on that page, that's something I posted when I did a program in the park called Make Your Own Home Nature Museum. I used to be a volunteer at a children's museum in Oak Park. And when that closed down for the pandemic, I started doing things like Make Your Own Home Nature Museum in my front yard. And I did it in Douglas Park for Earth Day this year, 5 years ago. Next. A bunch of people got together and did an Earth Day celebration in Douglas Park. One of those people was Sarah Heyman, who is in the audience today. She developed the idea to do a bird guide for the park and recruited me to help with it. And so you can see the video and play it again if you want to, of what that bird guide looks like. The significant thing that happened in part because of that is there was this artist called Heyman Cross who wanted to do a really big project in Douglas Park for the community. And he learned about the birds in Douglas Park and found out about the bird guide. And that was one of the inspirations for him to go ahead and put together this huge project to take the old beat up mini golf course that was right behind the field house within the sanctuary and take it from there. Ethan, there we go.
Sorry, misclicked the mute button. Anyways, so yeah, as my dad mentioned, Heyman Cross took this as part of his inspiration to kind of renovate this golf course. And kind of the idea behind it, and this whole Douglas 18 project was both for community engagement and the development of the golf course, and also the addition of a great new recreation source for the community. Both in terms of a new resource that is a up-to-date mini golf course, it's not dilapidated, and also stuff like plans for a concession stand and other aspects to help, fully flesh it out. And the way that this happened, so there's first a design phase. A bunch of youth from the area were effectively hired as interns to work on designing the golf course, and first got familiar with the nature in the area through both nature walks at Douglas Park, some of them led by us. You can see me in the left side of the top photo, but also tours of the Field Museum of Natural History, seeing how bird specimens can be used for art, and also just learning about birds in general. And also, I believe, tours of the Lincoln Park Zoo as well. And then they took all this inspiration and designed the course. You can see assorted stages of planning, both like practice with art, the initial prototypes, the on-the-ground prototypes, and yeah, even the full-scale I forget what it's called, the full-scale trial version. And initially it looked like this, decent spot for walking Peru, but not particularly good if you want to play mini golf. Then recently there was a construction on the area, making it into the nice thing that we see today, also in my background. And in addition to just being colorful and good looking, all these holes have designs relating or inspired by birds in the park. And each hole also has an interpretive sign with more information, I believe in English and Spanish, about the bird that inspired that hole. Yeah, so it's just a really awesome thing that has been added to the park lately. And it wouldn't have been possible with and it would not have been possible without the support of a lot of different partners, both individual people and larger institutions contributing to it. Yeah.
I had to move to a different computer. Don't unmute me, please.
Oh, sorry. I was like, what is that?
I don't want to see the video.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead, Ethan, go ahead.
Yeah. So the hours vary from week to week at the golf course, but I believe there's a website and the resources that you can use to find out what they are on any given week if you want to check it out. Plus in the off season, it's there too, and I believe more open. Yeah. I'll stop my share, then we can turn it over.
Yeah, Edith, I know you've got to go soon. So if you want to go ahead and speak for a little bit here, what time you have left?
Sorry about that. Sorry about the time confusion there. And I didn't even introduce myself in the beginning. I got distracted. But good evening, everyone. My name is Edith. I am a lifelong resident of the Little Village community. And a fun fact about me is that Douglas Park is actually my local park. So I've been going to Douglas Park since I was a kid with my family. And so it holds a very special place in my heart. I am also here with a few of my other neighbors in the area who we've been organizing since 2015, when Riot Fest first moved to Douglas Park. This was a very serious concern to us, just given the fact that their lack of community engagement prior to coming to Douglas Park. They were in Humboldt Park. And so they didn't come with the best reputation, right? And we had already seen from the pictures that were shared from Humboldt Park, the real destruction that was caused in the park, not only to our natural inhabitants, right? But also the folks that live near the park, limiting, right, public access to our parks. So since 2015, we've been organizing with a group of residents with support and lead with Una de la Vida. It's a local organization in our community. I added some links on the chat in case folks want to dig a little bit deeper into what is happening in our community. But I added, some presentation slides that include some images that were also shared in the presentation here with Eric and Ethan, right, of the impacts that are not only made again to the park, but also limiting and spending our public resources, right, for these parks when we know that there's designated concert venues, right, where these festivals can take place. So through the years, one concert after the other has unfortunately been added on to Douglas Park. Like I mentioned, we started off with Riot Fest. A few years ago, Summer Smash came in and took over the park in June. This year, unfortunately, now we are hosting 3 mega festivals that bring in, thousands of folks, mostly from the suburbs, to our neighborhoods that in Little Village as well as North Lawndale. We are seeing, right, the impacts that not only is in our infrastructure as far as like our public transportation, right, the fact that there's so much traffic backed up, the fact that our residents, right, are sharing with us that there's limited parking availability for, the folks that live around the park. And then also, right, the fact that when these concerts end, right, we see just a massive amount of litter, right? We unfortunately have, seen concert goers coming out heavily intoxicated, and unfortunately, very serious accidents, have occurred in these, few years of Douglas Park hosting these mega festivals. I do want to emphasize that there has been very little community engagement as far as the local officials that have signed off, right, in these festivals, privatizing our public parks. And so if folks want to click through some of the links, feel free to look at just how much involvement and how much pressure we've also added to not only our local officials, but also our local neighboring institutions, right, to make sure that their voice and opinions are also being heard, but not only elected officials, but definitely by, the Mayor Lightfoot, as well as, we're starting to look at, the Chicago Park District. We've been very strategic in attending their monthly board meetings and voicing our concerns, right? These past few weeks, since May 5th, which was our last in our larger community meeting, a lot of our residents were able to testify, right, and share that, that they are not in support of these festivals, although, they are being told, right, a lot of these lies where these festivals are bringing in a lot of opportunities, but we're actually not seeing those opportunities as in huge, park improvements, because our sidewalks are unfortunately inaccessible, right? And so we haven't really seen a lot of the positives. And so we have an upcoming community gathering. We have been meeting at the parks the weekends after every festival has been taking place. And so we've been not only picking up trash, but we've also been collecting petitions, signatures for our petition that we have. But we've also been making that connection, right? Making that one-on-one and making sure that residents are aware of what is happening to Douglas Park. I also want to share, right, that with the limitations of not only residents not having access to the park and the impacts, right, to our built environment, especially for birds, right? We've also heard from a lot of the small businesses, right, that they are not seeing the positive economic promises, right, that were given. And so I really want to encourage folks to support some of the local neighborhood organizing that has been going on, especially of how, these festivals impact our access to the parks. I also included some additional links to other neighborhood organizations that have posted on a regular basis and updated people and our base, right, of what's happening. I do want to end there. I do also want to encourage, that if folks have questions, there are more people on this call that can probably answer questions. If not, I can also leave my you can leave your sorry neighborhood noise. We can get connected if folks have specific questions. But yeah, thank you all so much for your time.
I'll also mention that a lot of the links that Eve's talked about are on our resources page. The one that's linked at the very top of the chat. You can check them out. You can sign the petition from there. You can look at the videos and all that stuff. And they'll be there forever. And maybe the chat won't be there with the video. I don't know. What we wanted to close with, we've been, kind of subtly pushing the idea that, you know, if you're a patch birder and you go to the same place over and over again, you can find out about things about birds that you might not be finding out otherwise. And you can contribute that as something that contributes to science. And when you find something rare, you can get other birders there to see it. And that's cool. But the other cool thing is what it does to you by going to the same place over and over again. The kind of attachment that you can develop to a place by going there time and time again. The kind of understanding you can develop, the kinds of like the relationship you can develop. I feel like I have a relationship with the dogbane beetles there and with the Canada geese there, but also with the wildflowers. You know, these are all things that are part of my life. I've been going there for so long now that, you know, I miss them if I go somewhere else. If I go to Costa Rica, I'm still thinking about the parks I go to on the west side of Chicago. There is a concept that kind of fits what I'm talking. Oh, and the other thing is two other things. First of all, there's also my attachment to the people there because I've been involved with these other community groups and I've learned a lot about the community over time. And I've maybe had a role in helping the community accomplish stuff. I've got my family connections. I have memories of being there with my kids over the years. I have memories of lots of other things. Memories of cool stuff I've seen, memories of bad things that I've seen. And it's just kind of all mixed together there in my relationship to Douglas Park. Academics have developed kind of a concept to cover this kind of relationship between a person and a place. It's called sense of place. And we've included some links to some academic and other literature that if you want to delve into the concept of sense of place, you can do it. It'll get you confused really fast because sense of place is a really complex kind of thing that can develop in so many different ways and develop in different ways for different people. But it's, you know, kind of at least interesting to look at to what other academic type people have been saying about this concept. Ethan, do you have anything to close with?
Yeah, I guess what I was going to mention is just on top of you can develop that for a park that you bird a lot or a patch, even just being cognizant of where you go on your everyday walk, either to work if you live close enough, like I fortunately do, to where I go to grad school here, or even just public transit or anything. And if you just, yeah, you can develop a much deeper attachment to your area just by paying attention to the wildlife that you casually bump into, right? In Albuquerque, I'm fortunate to have stuff like roadrunners to miss and kind of track through their breeding cycle. But even something as simple as these sort of doves that we get in my neighborhood, I miss. And the kingbirds every year when they come back, I miss it. I know where all the black-chinned hummingbirds here sit, which trees are surrounded by pygmy blue butterflies at the right time of year. When the prickly pears come to fruit, and I'm always tempted to take a couple home with me, but I feel bad because I don't know if the person who lives at that house wants it more than me. But anyways, yeah.
There's this sense of anticipation that's another part of sense of place when you go to a patch time and time again. You know kind of what to expect and you're waiting to see it, you're anticipating it, but then you also get the surprises that you don't expect, and that's another part of it. I'm sure if you think about the places that you've been to a lot, you've probably got a sense of place for them as well. And I know a lot of people around Douglas Park have developed a sense of that place, even if they don't know what to call it. And that's why they show up at these rallies to try and get the Mega Fest out of the park. And I think we're done talking, unless there are questions.
Well, I'd like to jump in again here briefly to say thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. So a quick round of virtual applause here for the Gyllenhaals and also Miss Tovar, who had to leave, but she'll see the recording. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, now is the time. If you want to just go ahead and either put it in the chat or even just unmute yourself and ask for a small enough group. Does anybody have any questions?
I've seen deer at at Columbus Park They've been showing up a couple times over the past few years, but they've never made it as far as Douglas Park, as far as I know. Columbus Park, they can travel there on the highway along the median strips and the sides of the highway. You can't do that too well with Columbus Park. I guess they could come along the railroad tracks, but the railroad tracks through there are awfully steep, so that would be kind of difficult. Maybe someday if they take out the railroad tracks and put in strips of green, we'll get deer at Columbus Park, but excuse me, at Douglas Park, but not so far.
Fingers crossed it stays that way. Any other questions out there? Okay. Well, on that note, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up then. Once again, thank you so much to our speakers for sharing all their expertise and knowledge and just, I mean, deep knowledge and experience with this site. I'm excited to see you guys all out there at some point now that you know this park inside and out. Go birding, go hiking, go golfing. And with that said, keep your eyes out for future Patch Chat programs. Obviously, this is a series that's, I wouldn't say regular, but we're doing them regularly enough, and we're hoping to do several more in this later summer and fall as well about some of the really cool areas. So keep your eyes peeled on the Chicago Ornithological and Chicago Audubon websites. They're really easy to get to. They're either chicagobirder.org or chicagoaudubon.org. And we will see you out there in the field and on a future program. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.